Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the 10th day of the Brian Terrell Movie Night Creepy Classic Countdown. Today, I'd like to share a scary story with all of you. This is Nule by Jan Mark. The house was not old enough to be interesting, just old enough to be starting to fall apart. The few interesting things had been dealt with ages ago when they first moved in. There was a bell push in every room, somehow connected to a glass case in the kitchen which contained a list of names and an indicator which wavered from name to name when a button was pushed, before settling on one of them. Parlor, drawing room, master bedroom, second bedroom, back bedroom. "What are they for?" said Libby one morning, after roving around the house and pushing all the buttons in turn. At that moment, Martin pushed the button in the front room, and the indicator slid up to parlor, vibrating there while the bell rang. And rang, and rang. "To fetch up the maid," said Mum. "We haven't got a maid." "No, but you've got me," said Mum, and tied an old sock over the bell, so that afterward it would only whir instead of ringing. The mouse holes in the kitchen looked interesting, too. The mice were bold and lounged about, making no effort at all to be timid and mouse-like. They sat on the draining board in the evenings and could scarcely be bothered to stir themselves when the light was switched on. "Easy living has made them soft," said Mum. "They have a gaming hall behind the boiler. They throw dice all day. They dance the can-can at night." "Come off it," said Dad. "You'll be finding crates of tiny gin bottles next." "They dance the can-can," Mum insisted. "Right over my head they dance it. I can hear them. If you didn't sleep so soundly, you'd hear them too." "Oh, that." "That's not mice," said Dad with a cheery smile. "That's rats." Mum minded the mice less than the bells until the day she found footprints in the frying pan. "Sorry, lads, the party's over," she said to the mice, who were no doubt combing the dripping from their elegant whiskers at that very moment. And the mouse holes were blocked up. Dad did the blocking up, and also some unblocking, so that after the bath no longer filled itself through the plug hole, the house stopped being interesting altogether. For a while. Libby and Martin did what they could to improve matters. Beginning in the cupboard under the stairs, they worked their way through the house, up to the attic, looking for something, anything, tapping walls and floors, scouring cupboards, measuring and calculating, but there were no hidden cavities, no secret doors, no ambiguous bulges under the wallpaper except where the damp got in. The cupboard below the stairs was full of old pickle jars, and what they found in the attic didn't please anyone, least of all Dad. "That's dry rot," he said. "Thank God this isn't our house," and went cantering off to visit the estate agents, Tench and Tench, in the High Street. Dad called them Shark and Shark. As he got to the gate, he turned back and yelled, "The plague! The plague!" Put a red cross on the door, which made Mrs. Bowen over the fence lean right out of her landing window instead of hiding behind the curtains. When Dad came back from the estate agents, he was growling. "Shark Jr. says that since the whole row is coming down inside 2 years, it isn't worth bothering about. I understand that the new bypass is going to run right through the scullery." "Well, what did Shark Sr. say?" said Mom. "I didn't see him. I've never seen him. I don't believe there is a Shark Sr., said Dad. "I think he's dead. I think young Shark keeps him in a box under the bed." "Don't be nasty," said Mom, looking at Libby, who worried about things under the bed even in broad daylight. "I just hope we find a house of our own before this place collapses on our heads. And we shan't be buying it from the Sharks." She went back to her sewing, not in a good mood. The mice had broken out again. Libby went into the kitchen to look for them. Martin ran upstairs, rhyming, "Mr. Shark, in the dark, under the bed, dead." When he came down again, Mum was putting away the sewing, and Libby was parading around the hall in a pointed hat with a veil and a long red dress that looked rich and splendid unless you knew, as Martin did, that it was made of old curtains. The hall was dark in the rainy summer afternoon, and Libby slid from shadow to shadow, rustling. "What are you meant to be?" said Martin. "An old witch?" "I'm Sleeping Beauty's mother," said Libby, and lowering her head she charged along the hall, pointed hat foremost, like a unicorn. Martin changed his mind about walking downstairs and slid down the banister instead. He suspected that he would not be allowed to do this for much longer. Already the banister rail creaked, and who knew where the dreaded dry rot would strike next. As he reached the upright posts at the bottom of the stairs, Mum came out of the back room, lugging the sewing machine, and just missed being impaled on Libby's hat. "Stop rushing up and down," said Mum. "And you," she said, turning to Martin, "stop swinging on that newel post. Do you want to tear it up by the roots?" The newel post was supposed to be holding up the banisters, but possibly it was the other way around. At the foot it was just a polished wooden post, but further up it had been turned on a lathe, with slender hips, a waist, a bust almost, and square shoulders. On top was a round ball, as big as a head. There was another at the top of the stairs, but it had lost its head. Dad called it Anne Boleyn. The one at the bottom was simply a newel post, but Libby thought that this too was its name. Newel Post, like Anne Boleyn or Libby Anderson. Mrs. Newel Post. Lady Newel Post. When she talked to it, she just called it Newel. The pointed hat and the old curtains were Libby's costume for the school play. Martin had managed to stay out of the school play, but he knew all of Libby's lines by heart as she chanted them round the house, up and down, in a strained, jerky voice, one syllable per step. "My dear, we must invite all the fairies to the christening. Hello, Newell, we will not invite the wicked fairy." On the last day of term, he sat with Mum and Dad in the school hall and watched Libby go through the same routine on stage. She was word perfect, in spite of speaking as though her shock absorbers had collapsed. But as most of the cast spoke the same way, it didn't sound so very strange. Once the holidays began, Libby went back to talking like Libby, although she still wore the pointed hat and the curtains until they began to drop to pieces. The curtains went for dusters, but the pointed hat was around for a long time until Mum picked it up and threatened, "Take this thing away or it goes in the dustbin." Libby shunted up and down the stairs a few times with the hat on her head, and then Mum called out that Jane next door had come to play. If Libby had been at the top of the stairs, she might have left the hat on her head, but she was almost at the bottom, so she plonked it down on Newell's cannonball head and went out to fight Jane over whose turn it was to kidnap the teddy bear. She hoped it was Jane's turn. If Libby were the kidnapper, she would have to sit about for ages holding Teddy to ransom behind the water tank, while Jane galloped around the garden on her imaginary pony, whacking the hydrangea bushes with a broomstick. The hat definitely did something for Newell. When Martin came in later by the front door, he thought at first that it was a person standing at the foot of the stairs. He had to look twice before he understood who it was. Mum saw it at the same time. "I told Libby to put that object away or I'd throw it in the dustbin." "Oh, don't," said Martin. "Leave it for Dad to see." So she left it, but Martin began to get ideas. The hat made the rest of Newell look very undressed, so he fetched down the old housecoat that had been hanging behind the bathroom door when they moved in. It was purple, with blue paisley swimming all over it, and very worn, as though it had been somebody's favorite housecoat. The sleeves had set in creases around arms belonging to someone they had never known. Turning it front to back, he buttoned it like a bib around Newell's neck, so that it hung down to the floor. He filled 2 gloves with screwed-up newspaper, poked them into the sleeves, and pinned them there. The weight made the arms dangle and opened the creases. He put a pair of football boots under the hem of the housecoat, with the toes just sticking out, and stood back to see how it looked. As he expected, in the darkness of the hall it looked just like a person, waiting, although there was something not so much lifelike as death-like in the hang of those dangling arms. Mum and Libby first saw Newell as they came out of the kitchen together. "Who on earth did this?" said Mum as they drew alongside. "It wasn't me," said Libby, and sounded very glad that it wasn't. "It was you left the hat, wasn't it?" "Yes, but not the other bits." "What do you think?" said Martin. "Horrible thing," said Mum, but she didn't ask him to take it down. Libby sidled round Nule and ran upstairs, as close to the wall as she could get. When Dad came home from work, he stopped in the doorway and said, "Hello, who's that? Who—" before Martin put the light on and showed him. "An idol, I suppose," said Dad. "Nule, god of dry rot," and he bowed low at the foot of the stairs. At the same time, the hat slipped forward slightly, as if Nule had lowered its head in acknowledgment. Martin also bowed low before reaching up to put the hat straight. Mum and Dad seemed to think that Nule was rather funny, so it stayed at the foot of the stairs. They never bowed to it again, but Martin did every time he went upstairs, and so did Libby. Libby didn't talk to Nule anymore, but she watched it a lot. One day she said, "Which way is it facing?" "Forwards, of course," said Martin, but it was hard to tell unless you looked at the feet. He drew two staring eyes and a toothy smile on a piece of paper and cut them out. They were attached to the front of Nule's head with little bits of chewing gum. "That's better," said Libby, laughing, and next time she went upstairs she forgot to bow. Martin was not so sure. Nule looked ordinary now, just like a Nule post wearing a housecoat, football boots, and the Sleeping Beauty's mother's hat. He took off the eyes and the mouth and rubbed away the chewing gum. "That's better," he said, while Nule stared once more without eyes and smiled without a mouth. Libby said nothing. At night, the house creaked. "Thieves' footsteps," said Libby. "It's the furniture warping," said Mum. Libby thought she said that the furniture was walking, and she could well believe it. The dressing table had feet with claws. Why shouldn't it walk in the dark, tugging fretfully this way and that because the clawed feet pointed in opposite directions? The bath had feet too. Libby imagined it galloping out of the bathroom and tobogganing downstairs on its stomach like a great white walrus plunging into the sea. If someone held the door open, it would whiz up the path and crash into the front gate. If someone held the gate open, it would shoot across the road and hit the district nurse's car, which she parked under the street light opposite. Libby thought of headlines in the local paper, "Nurse run over by bath," and giggled until she heard the creaks again. Then she hid under the bedclothes. In his bedroom, Martin heard the creaks too, but he had a different reason for worrying. In the attic where the dry rot lurked, there was a big oak wardrobe full of old dead ladies' clothes. It was directly over his head. Supposing it came through? Next day he moved the bed. The vacuum cleaner had lost its casters and had to be helped, by Libby pushing from behind. It skidded up the hall and knocked Nule's football boots askew. "The Hoover doesn't like Nule either," said Libby. Although she wouldn't talk to Nule anymore, she liked talking about it, as though that somehow made Nule safer. "What's that?" said Mum. "It knocked Nule's feet off." "Well, put them back," said Mum, but Libby preferred not to. When Martin came in, he set them side by side, but later they were kicked out of place again. If people began to complain that Nule was in the way, Nule would have to go. He got around this by putting the right boot where the left had been, and the left boot on the bottom stair. When he left it, the veil on the hat was hanging down behind, but as he went upstairs after tea, he noticed that it was now draped over Nule's right shoulder, as if Nule had turned its head to see where its feet were going. That night the creaks were louder than ever, like a burglar on hefty tiptoe. Libby had mentioned thieves only that evening, and Mum had said, "What have we got worth stealing?" Martin felt fairly safe because he had worked out that if the wardrobe fell tonight, it would land on his chest of drawers and not on him. But what might it not bring down with it? Then he realized that the creaks were coming not from above, but from below. He held his breath. Downstairs didn't creak. His alarm clock gleamed greenly in the dark and told him that it had gone 2 o'clock. Mom and Dad were asleep ages ago. Libby would sooner burst than leave her bed in the dark. Perhaps it was a burglar. Feeling noble and reckless, he put on the bedside lamp, slid out of bed, trod silently across the carpet. He turned on the main light and opened the door. The glow shone out of the doorway and saw him as far as the landing light switch at the top of the stairs, but he never had time to turn it on. From the top of the stairs he could look down into the hall where the street light opposite shone coldly through the frosted panes of the front door. It shone on the hall stand where the coats hung, on the blanket chest and the brass jug that stood on it, and on the broody telephone that never rang at night. It did not shine on Nule. Nule was not there. Nule was halfway up the stairs, one hand on the banister, and one hand holding up the housecoat clear of its boots. The veil on the hat drifted like smoke across the frosted glass of the front door. Nule creaked and came up another step. Martin turned and fled back to the bedroom and dived under the bedclothes, just like Libby, who was 3 years younger and believed in ghosts. "Were you reading in bed last night?" said Mum, prodding him awake next morning. Martin came out from under the pillow very slowly. "No, Mum." "You went to sleep with the light on." "Both lights," she said, leaning across to switch off the one by the bed. "I'm sorry." "Perhaps you'd like to pay the next electricity bill?" Mum had brought him a cup of tea, which meant that she had been down to the kitchen and back again, unscathed. Martin wanted to ask her if there was anything strange on the stairs, but he didn't quite know how to put it. He drank the tea, dressed, and went along the landing. He looked down into the hall, where the sun shone through the frosted glass of the front door, onto the hall stand, the blanket chest, the honesty plants in the brass jug, and the telephone that began to ring as he looked at it. It shone on Nule, standing with its back to him at the foot of the stairs. Mum came out of the kitchen to answer the phone, and Martin went down and stood 3 steps up, watching Nule and waiting for Mum to finish talking. Nule looked just as it always did. Both feet were back on ground level, side by side. "I wish you wouldn't hang about like that when I'm on the phone," said Mum, putting down the receiver and turning around. "Eavesdropper. Breakfast will be ready in 5 minutes." She went back into the kitchen, and Martin sat on the blanket chest, looking at Nule. It was time for Nule to go. He should walk up to Nule this minute, kick away the boots, rip off the housecoat, throw away the hat. But he stayed where he was, watching the motionless football boots, the dangling sleeves. The breeze from an open window stirred the hem of the housecoat and revealed the wooden post beneath, rooted firmly in the floor as it had been for 70 years. There were no feet in the boots, no arms in the sleeves. If he destroyed Nule, it would mean that he believed that he had seen Nule climbing the stairs last night. But if he left Nule alone, Nule might walk again. Martin had a problem.